Hello, everybody. My name is Christina Palladino. I'm very happy to be here moderating this great discussion we're going to have for the next hour. If everyone can just keep their video and audio off for now, we will be taking questions in a little bit, so feel free to write them in the chat and just be engaged with this discussion. So welcome to the first of several series of a new conversation series that we're having called the New 612. This is going to be a great discussion of a lot of different topics over the next few months related to Minneapolis. So again, as you enter the webinar here, attendees just have your audio and video muted, and then we'll be taking questions throughout the hour here. So I would like to introduce the panelists that we have here for the next hour. Like I said, my name is Christina Palladino. I work for Park Street Public, former news reporter, so I'll be moderating this discussion. And I'd like to introduce first Jill Osiki, the Executive Director of the Uptown Association. Jill has worked with the Uptown Association since 2014, and she has been in the Executive Director position for 2 years. She has over 25 years of experience producing large events and working with communities. The Uptown Association produces the Uptown Art Fair, which has been running for over 57 years now. Next, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Weinhagen. He's the president of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce. Jonathan was named president and CEO of the Regional Chamber by the organization's board of directors in 2016. The Minneapolis Regional Chamber was founded in 1881 and believes that the business community thrives when we all work together to build strong communities and partnerships. Jonathan was previously vice president of the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce. He also serves as chair of the Mounds View School Board. And finally, I'd like to introduce David McCallum. He has worked extensively as a consultant on local, national, and international projects in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. His previous experience includes work as a consultant with McKinsey in the corporate strategy group at Ameriprise and as an administrator and professor at Carleton College. His educational background is in computer science. He has served as a board member and committee chair for Hennepin Healthcare System, the provider system in Hennepin County. So as I said, this is a new series of conversations we're going to be having called the New 612. Up first is a balance of payment reports. And so we're going to kind of dive deep into Dave's analysis and report that his firm has done. And it's really interesting. And he's going to kind of take a deep dive into that. And then we're going to get into a panel discussion in a little bit and really talk a little bit more about how this report and these data affect real issues related to residents and businesses of Minneapolis. The report, as I said, was compiled by a local research firm, McCallum Ross, for the chamber, and it found a negative balance of payments for Minneapolis, and that the city generates 3.5 times more in tax revenue to the state than it receives. And this, of course, has a real impact on businesses and residents across the city and what we know has already been a very traumatic year with the pandemic and the social unrest following the death of George Floyd. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave just to, like I said, kind of walk us through this report and help us illustrate what a negative balance of payment report means, and again, kind of the larger impact it has on the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota. So Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much. This loads up, here we go. So let's just say at a very informal and high level what a balance of payments analysis is. You take a look at what the residents and businesses of a region, city, state, county, whatever it happens to be, pay in terms of taxes to a government or a series of governments. And then you look at what they receive back in terms of aid or various forms of support from the same government. So what you're really, the balance is between how much you pay out in taxes versus how much you receive back in aid. This balance of payment type of analysis is done across the country by various sorts of organization. And it if you have a negative balance of payments, in this way of talking about stuff, what you have is you pay more in taxes to the state than you receive back in state-funded aids, right? So you're paying out more than you get back. It really concerns only what individuals and businesses pay in taxes and what they receive in state-funded aid. So one of the things to be clear is when you think about the aid that flows to individuals or to corporations in a given region, some of it is actually federal, a lot of it is actually federal money that might flow through a state agency or a county agency. That's not included in this state level balance of payments because that's money that's coming from the feds and the state just passes it through to individuals or to corporations. So when we talk about aids being paid to an individual, to corporations, sometimes it's directly in dollars, but more often it's in terms of services that are provided by the local governments. So that's the other thing that I want you to have in your mind as you go through this. So that's the fundamental structure of things. The State House Research Organization does this analysis and has for many years, and they're the primary source of the data. In addition, the city of Minneapolis, their finance organization, has done an analysis at the city level. That's the other source of organization of the data for this. So the data for all of this is publicly available, verifiable, and in an ongoing way. So if anybody is curious to look into that, you can do that, or you can of course reach out to me and we can talk about the way that we did it here. So in 2017, which is the most recently available year for the data, the residents and businesses of Minneapolis had a negative balance of payments of 1.43 billion, which means so they paid out more than they got back. In particular, they paid out 1.97 in taxes and got back 0.54 in aids. So what is that? The next couple of bullet points are important because it really tells you that both the taxes and the aids come in just a very small number of categories. So the taxes, the 1.97 billion in taxes, 51% were from individual income tax. So residents of Minneapolis paid out 51% of the taxes of this amount that went to the state in individual tax. 31% was sales and use taxes, and 9% was corporate taxes. So those three together make up 91%. On the converse side, in terms of the aids that are received back by the residents and businesses, again, 91%, but this time is made up of just two categories, 76% in education and 15% in LGA, that's local government. This is a program that goes on across the state, and all counties receive and municipalities receive LGA back. So this negative, so that's the basic story in 2017. There's two ways in which I want to say that Minneapolis is, two ways I want to generalize this slightly. One, the negative balance of payments for Minneapolis is mirrored by negative balance of payments for the 7-county metro area. That's so in the 7-county metro area, it's minus 3.46 billion. And in Hennepin County in particular, it's 2.45 billion. So once again, the Twin Cities and Hennepin County in particular have the same sort of negative balance of payments as the city of Minneapolis. They pay out more in taxes than they receive back in aid from the state government. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that this is not a one-year blip, in case that was occurring to you. This is that we have data back to 2004, so we got about almost 15 years of data at this point, a little short of that. And that pattern has been consistent throughout that time. So this is a long-standing situation about the relationship between taxes and aids that occurs. So that summary, let me just look at these pages here that give you a kind of graphical representation of basically the same stuff that I've been saying, right? This page gives you a bar graph that shows you at the top the various taxes that are paid out in Minneapolis in 2017, and then the aids that were the aids that were paid back from the state to the residents and businesses in Minneapolis, or in terms of programs or dollars. And you can see that a little bit more detail, transportation and property are quite small in terms of taxes paid. Things like that, the pension funds, libraries, and municipal dollars paid back to the Minneapolis in terms of aids, that's also quite small. But you can see as well, just graphically, the ratio here. This next slide points to a larger pattern that exists in the relationship between, in the balance of payments between the metro area and greater Minnesota. So if you look at the metro area and you see the almost black blob there is Hennepin County, and the others around it are quite dark. On the left, that's the total taxes, so that's the higher amounts. And the total aids, conversely, if you look at Hennepin and the other counties around, are quite a light color, which means that they're getting proportionally smaller amounts of aid back. And you can see, so that basically is a heat map version of what we were just talking about in words and in a bar chart. But if you want to, you can also just look and eyeball across the state where it is that people pay out taxes versus receive back aids. And you can see that in a large portion of greater Minnesota, that aids are a darker color than taxes. You know, that's a way of, if aids are a darker color than taxes on these two maps, that means that you have a negative balance of payments. Whereas if taxes are a darker color than aids, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. If taxes are darker than aids, then you have a negative balance of payments. If aids are darker than taxes, then you have a positive balance of payments. So you can look in the top left-hand corner of Minnesota. I won't pick out the name of the county in particular, but it's obviously the aids are a darker color than the taxes, which means that it's a positive balance of payment. They get more aid than they pay out in taxes. This here chart, and this is the last one here before we turn it over for discussion and questions, shows you that pattern back to 2004 of comparing the 7-county metro with greater Minnesota in terms of the taxes and the aids, where you can see that all the way back on the right-hand side in the 7-county area, considerably more is paid out in taxes than is received back in aids. Whereas in greater Minnesota, they have been receiving more in aids than they pay out in taxes over the same time period. So that's the fundamental facts about this. There are, of course, nuances and issues that we can cover in the discussion or that can be further researched. But I think that to leave as much time as possible for discussion, I think I can stop at this point. And should I stop sharing this screen, Christina, do you think, or?
Yeah, I think that would be great. And then if we want to pull the report back up to reference something, we can do that as well.
Perfect. Okay, I'll stop sharing then.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, let's get started with our discussion. And again, just for everyone who is attending, this is being recorded and the link will be sent out as well as Dave's report. So you can have that to look over at another time. All right, great. Well, I'd like to just get kind of initial reactions from the panelists on Dave's presentation and just kind of initially what this report means to you. Jill, let's start with yourself.
You know, it's interesting because it was something that it was a little suspect, right? But to actually see the study done and see it in a report form is very interesting, especially for how long the data was looked at. And, you know, Minneapolis has thrived for a very long time, which we're very proud of. And this group obviously plays a very big part in that. Right now, Minneapolis is not thriving and we are struggling. So definitely it's nice to hear that we do need assistance that should be there for us, and that we've supported a lot for a very long time, but we need help from everyone. So it's just interesting to see it on paper.
Yeah. Jonathan, your initial reactions?
Yeah, Christina, thank you. And thanks for being with us this morning. I think a couple of thoughts. One, Minneapolis and our state have experienced tremendous challenges over the course of the last 12 months, from a global pandemic to the civil unrest that kind of compounded issues for our business community, and a real need for some disaster relief in the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul. And that was really the impetus for this study. As we headed into the legislative session, 9 to 10 months post civil unrest with no substantive state disaster relief, when we started hearing this constant drumbeat of people not wanting to bail out Minneapolis, and we started asking the foundational question of like, is that even a thing? Could Minneapolis be bailed out? I think many of us, myself included, believe that the data that we heard today and that this report sheds a light on was going to be the case, and it validates and verifies that. So we engaged with Dave to pull this together, and it tells us very much that story that Minneapolis has been a net contributor. I want to be really clear, though, that this is not a moment where we're saying we want all of ours back. It's a moment to highlight that we are an interconnected statewide economy, that Greater Minnesota needs the Metro and Minneapolis and the Metro needs Greater Minnesota. And if there was ever a time in our state's history to come together and to do this work together and to appreciate what I call asset preservation, because I believe that's what Minneapolis is and the Minneapolis economy, now is that time. So my hope is that what we heard from Dave is kind of a rallying cry for the state to say, let's put this, Greater Minnesota, Minneapolis Metro, division aside, and let's all pull together to figure out how do we bring Minneapolis back to that place that Jill framed and highlighted, get it back to a place where it's generating, 3.5 times what it's bringing back in state aid, to make sure that we can continue to support and invest in all of the things that we want to invest in across the state of Minnesota.
Yeah. So what are the consequences of having a negative balance of payments for the city of Minneapolis? Jonathan, can you kind of just go a little deeper into, what are the consequences, and what do you think people should take away from kind of the numbers? Sometimes the numbers can glaze over us, but kind of drive home, what happens when we have this?
I'm not sure that I would frame it as consequences, Christina. Again, I think that, and we did a 15-year look back, Minneapolis is happy to play its role in driving the state's economy. I think the consequences of not, preserving that, of taking this us versus them approach, of thinking about the economic recovery for the economic engine of the state, is really dangerous. So I believe that from a statewide perspective, the state of Minnesota needs Minneapolis to get back to the point where it is churning out a negative balance of payments. That's in part how we manage a statewide budget from a local standpoint. We know that a lot of dollars, and they're not reflected in this study, come from the federal government. But when it comes to the revenues that are generated locally, Minneapolis is contributing a disproportionate share, and we should all be looking at that and going, how do we get back there? How do we make sure that we preserve that? Because our statewide economy needs it.
And Jill, obviously representing the Uptown Association, what does that mean for residents and businesses, particularly in the Uptown area? What's kind of your perspective on that?
Yeah, so Jonathan did touch on this last year, obviously has been such a unique experience, and not only COVID, but the unrest. And we're still obviously dealing with that in so many different ways. It's been very hard for many of our businesses to function, which has been hit hard. We've had many closures, and that impacts our residents because Uptown is very unique in that not only do we have a very large business community, but residentially as well. So those two things really depend on each other to function. And what we're seeing is that imbalance of residents unable to go to their local places for food, to shop, and it's happening all over, not just uptown, but of course all over South Minneapolis and Minneapolis as a whole. And I feel like we just need a little help to kind of get through some of this hard time. And I still feel the excitement. The residents want to support everyone locally, but just like in Uptown, we do get a lot of visitors coming from local suburbs, and they want that experience. They want to experience the really fantastic places to come and visit and experience something a little different than what your suburb may look like. And if we can't get by, within these next year or so, it's only going to get worse for us. And then it's only going to get harder for businesses to kind of recoup those costs, for sure.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, in your opinion, how do we, encourage people from across the state to frequent places like Uptown, to eat, shop, and play more? What needs to be done between now and the next few years to get this back on track?
That's a really tricky question, Christina, because there's so many levels of that. Obviously, we've had some issues with crime. We have issues with parking. We have issues that, some of the favorite places have now closed down. So we need to fill those locations with fantastic things like they have in the past, or continue to keep those businesses thriving so people will come. It has to be comfortable. It has to be safe. So there's many things that hopefully the city will also help with, and it's things like the Uptown Art Fair. We do get many residents coming from all over the state to come to that event, as well as people that live locally and just bike and walk. And without those type of events and locations for people to come, it will just get passed by. And I think it's super important to kind of continue that culture, and for Minnesotans to really understand that that's such a big part of us. And again, some state funding is definitely needed.
Yeah. Jonathan, you mentioned there's this notion that, the rest of the state is bailing out Minneapolis. How do you think we effectively communicate to folks in, greater Minnesota that this is not true, as we saw from Dave's report, and get people to understand, like you mentioned, we're all interconnected?
Yeah, Christine, I think it's all about conversations and relationships and communication. And that's the business that you're in. It's certainly the business that we're in. We need to get much more intentional about how we do that outreach, how we share those stories. And I think that's what gets lost in a lot of this. What we're talking about, and I'll give great credit to Representative Aisha Gomez. I stood with her in front of a pile of rubble a couple of weeks ago, the same pile of rubble that we stood in front of 10 months ago when we called on the legislature to make an investment and to help that Lake Street corridor. And she reminded us that Lake Street is our main street. West Broadway is our main street. Uptown is our main street. And we spend a lot of time talking about main streets across the state. And I think we envision those as being, very much a greater Minnesota or rural concept and construct, but they're every bit as much important to the communities here as they are across the state. So I think we need to meet people where they're at. I think we need to tell the stories. We're not talking about a bailout for Minneapolis. We're talking about supporting small businesses that have been impacted. The very same way that we talk about supporting small businesses that get flooded when the Red River Valley floods in the spring, and we all rally and we come together as Minnesotans, to do that important work of rebuilding. That's the same work that we need to be doing and thinking about here. And I think if we could translate that commonality, I think we get so caught up with this, urban, suburban, ex-urban, rural, quote unquote, divide, that we forget that there's far more that unites us than divides us. There's far more commonality, particularly when we kind of peel back the onion and think about small businesses who are risking everything, who are creating jobs, who are making investments. But that looks the same on Lake Street as it does in downtown Red Wing. And I think we need to tell those really personal and intimate stories.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when you think about that, and you have great relationships, both of you, with small business owners in the city, just kind of give some context to how a lot of these small business owners have really weathered this last year. I mean, it's been remarkable. Minneapolis has been in the international spotlight for some very painful reasons. Just talk about how resilient a lot of these business owners are. They're still standing and they're still committed to making a great Minneapolis. Jonathan, would you like to go?
I can give a good example.
Oh, sure.
That'd be great, Jill.
We have a local restaurant that's a small business, Amazing Thailand, which has been in Uptown right on Hennepin Avenue for many, many years. It's a favorite of many people. And they've gone through a lot in the last several years, let's say. There's been a reconstruction of Hennepin Avenue that took away some of their drop-off and pick-up parking right in front of their location. So they've been struggling with that and how to work around it. COVID hit them very hard, especially without being able to pick up food right in front of their restaurant. They've gotten very creative on how to make that happen. And unfortunately, during the unrest, they were kind of smack dab in the middle of what was happening, and the rioting and looting was right in front of them. And the owners and managers spent 3 nights, did not leave their restaurant the entire time, and pleaded with rioters and looters to essentially leave them alone throughout the evening. And they had some damage, but because they were present and there, and they were able to do some boarding up, they came out of it with small damage, but it was very traumatizing. And during all of that time, when we organized many artists to come and paint plywood murals and express themselves of truly amazing feelings that were happening during that time, Amazing Thailand came and fed those artists, hundreds of those artists during that time. And they had monks come and bless our community. And it was truly a small town experience, like Jonathan says, but right in Minneapolis. And that business is not alone in how they've been creative, kind of dealing with COVID issues, unrest issues. And because they're creative and because they are just great in the community, I hope to see them thrive. But they need help. And unfortunately, they just, because they didn't have maybe a lot of damage, let's say, to their location, they may not qualify for a lot of some of those private donations that were helping to help with the damage from the unrest. But all the effort that they've put in, I would hate for something to happen to that they would have to close down after so many years and such a great business in our community. So, I mean, that's just one example, and there's so many, so many.
Jill, I think that's right. I mean, I could probably highlight 100 examples. I will try not to do that. But I think, Christina, you used the word resilient. If pivot was the kind of the cliche of the beginning of the pandemic, I think resilience is secondary to that. And that's exactly what we've been seeing with our business community in Minneapolis and across the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. Earlier this year, we hosted our annual meeting and highlighted 3 small business owners who each did their pivot over the course of the pandemic. Dana Frank, the CEO of First Avenue Productions, who really led a national charge to save our stages. And much of what we're experiencing today and kind of the hope that we have these small independent venues are going to survive is because of advocacy work that originated in First Avenue and at the Turf Club and at the Fitz right here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. We heard from an executive from Chow Girls, a catering company. And we know hospitality was devastated across the board. And their pivot was into feeding those in need and creating an opportunity to show up in a way that our community needed, but that also sustained their employment base and their company. And then a guy like Houston White, who has a vision for reimagining North Minneapolis and Camden Town. It started with a barber shop, and just a couple of weeks ago he broke ground on an addition where they're going to add a coffee roastery, and then a plan for executive housing, and really thinking about building beyond his core business. So like resilience is the perfect word to describe what we're seeing, feeling, and experiencing. And these folks have been pounded, right? Like they got hammered by the pandemic. We were just headed into what felt like, if you remember in May, a little bit of relief with the virus because we were headed into the summer and people could get outside and we might be able to do more things. And then we experienced the unrest across our region. And the second thing that I would highlight, and the thing that I think inspired me most in those hours and days after George Floyd's death, right? Remember May 26th, 27th, and 28th, literally you could walk Lake Street and I could still smell the destruction in our city. And almost to a business owner, it wasn't a woe is me. It was a we need to rebuild. It was a how do we build back better? And subsequently, and Jill highlighted this, there's been a lot of private relief efforts. There's been great funds at the federal level. There's been funding locally, and that has all been great, and it has been a great benefit to so many business owners. But when I talk to them about what they really want, it's not a $25,000 grant from a foundation or from a city or from the federal government. It's not rent relief. It's to reopen their stores, to do the thing that they're good at, to sell their products, to hire their people back, to engage their community in the way that they did pre-pandemic. And you want to talk about resilience, to me, that's the ultimate show of resilience. They want to do the thing that they were built to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to follow up with that, Jill, what are you seeing with a lot of these small shops and restaurants that can't fully open yet, just because there are still some restrictions? We are seeing, the light at the end of the tunnel with Minnesota's doing a great job with vaccinations, and we're hopeful we're going to get there. But it's hard. It's hard to kind of keep on that 50 to 75% capacity when, that actually costs more money sometimes. If you want to just kind of talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, because they're still limited in the numbers of guests that they can take in, for instance, in a restaurant or even a store, your costs continue to be the same or even higher because you are putting in new ways to combat or keep up on COVID restrictions and things like that, and implement new ideas. So your costs may be even increasing, and but your capacity is so limited. So it's like Jonathan says, you have to be so resilient and you have to be so creative. Even just with the great weather, Uptown is feeling that it's even a bit back to life just recently. It's great to be outdoors. I think we're all more comfortable outdoors. So there is hope, and I think that's what we thrive on, is that hope that we will get back to whatever a normal is. And I think people are very excited to be out and about if they are comfortable. But again, that could be limited. It's going to take a very long time to get back to that whatever that norm was, or being able to function at 100%. And we don't know how long that's going to take. And so businesses are cutting as many costs as they can. But again, in some cases, it's increasing. They've had to implement so many new ways to do their business. And some of those have been positive, but there is a cost to that, as always.
Christina, if I could, I would just add on to, I think Jill made some really great observations and exactly what we're hearing, seeing, and feeling. I always like to think of what can we do? Because I feel like, we're a year into this thing, and, there are moments of despair, I'll tell you, that I feel them. And I hear it in the voices of business owners. But I also feel like we all have a role in this. And I'm a big believer that we get to choose the city and the region that we want to emerge into with regards to our economic recovery. And I would call on anybody who's watching this today or thinking about the role they can play, is to change your habits. Shop more local. Think about investing locally. Third-party providers are great for food delivery, but I will tell you, there's nothing that puts a smile on a restaurant owner's face more than taking your direct phone call and saying, I'm going to come pick it up, and you're not going to have to pay the 30% additional fee that has really sustained a lot of folks. So I mean, we should celebrate that innovation and think about those moments where we can show up for our small business community and these things that really are the fabric of our city. I mean, if we want those things to be post-COVID, we need to think about that every day. And again, to Jill's point, there's a safety component. Different folks are in different places with regards to vaccination or their level of comfort. But to the extent that you are, Minneapolis and these businesses are open for business, and they would welcome nothing more than for people to think about that and really intentionally double down on that investment.
Well, let's kind of end here on this note that Jonathan kind of reiterated at the top of the program, that a strong Minneapolis is a strong Minnesota. Just kind of give people kind of your closing thoughts on that, and what people should take away from this this program on kind of that theory.
I'm happy to start. We can all look back a couple of years, and Governor Walz ran a successful campaign on a One Minnesota message. And partisan politics aside, I think it was really emblematic of who we are as a state. If you think back to the Minnesota Miracle, we doubled down, we linked arms, we came together, and we created one of the greatest economies, I would argue, in the world, certainly in this country. We're at a knife edge right now. That's the exact same moment that we are in. Everybody across this country and the globe is dealing with and experiencing a global pandemic. There's certainly some different aspects to it depending upon where you go, but we're not unique. And when I talk to my counterparts in Boston and Austin and Dallas and San Francisco, every downtown is experiencing what we're experiencing downtown Minneapolis. Every city and region is experiencing the challenges of a sustained global pandemic and thinking about the strategies to drive us forward. We have the additional layer of civil unrest, and you're really having the eyes of the world on us with the trial of former Minneapolis Police Department officer Derek Chauvin, the impending trial of the additional 3 officers, the anniversary of George Floyd's death. So all of those things for us are compounding. And if there was ever a moment to come together and double down, not just on Minneapolis, but on this region and this state, and again, to link arms and think about how do we chart a path forward together, I believe this is that moment. And if we do it well, we are going to experience an economic recovery that is faster than our peers. We did that back in 08-09. If we remember back to the Great Recession, we emerged stronger than most of our counterparts across the country. And we have the opportunity to do that, and I believe we have the will to do that, but it is going to take a One Minnesota message to come together and to do that work.
Great. Jill?
I don't think I could add any more. I 100% agree with Jonathan, and the One Minnesota is very important, and I truly believe we can do it.
Excellent. Dave, any last thoughts from you on your analysis and report that you want to leave attendees with?
Sorry about that. I had to unmute. This has been a very interesting conversation for me because I was just focused on the numbers, which Jonathan and his colleagues asked me to do, and it was pretty clear. What you do with this stuff is often less clear and nuanced, involves all kinds of other dimensions. The one thing I would circle back to is a comment that I made at the beginning, which is that When you're talking to folks about the government and the role of government in people's lives, and then comparing the cities and Minneapolis in particular to other parts of the state, to keep in mind that people are often emotionally focused on sources of funding that are really federal monies, things associated with, what we used to call welfare and things like that, right? And that's, a lot of people are really thinking about that, and that's not what this is about. I mean, that's not, in many ways, that's just not under the purview of the state. And so when we're talking about the state's policies, the state's taxing and aids, we really are talking about businesses and income and infrastructure and all those sorts of things, where I think it actually is easier to be able to come together and embrace the one Minnesota vision that Jonathan laid out.
Yeah, great. Well, I just wanted to take a pause here for any questions from folks who are tuning in. Please feel free to enter them in the chat to all the panelists here. So let's just take a quick pause. If anyone has any questions, fire away. I don't see any here on the chat, so give you guys a couple of seconds to type something up. And just while we wait for some questions to come in, I do want to say that this is the first of a series of conversations over the next few months. We're going to have some great upcoming topics that are really relevant to what's happening in the city and in the news. And so if you do want more information, you can go to anew612.com to find out what all is going to be happening. And I'm excited to be moderating some of the next ones coming up. So this was a great first discussion on our new series. So doesn't look like there's any questions coming through. Anybody else last thoughts, or do you think?
Christine, I did see one question come through related to the remaining weeks of the legislative session. So I would start by saying, we kind of broke from legislative recess yesterday, so we're back at it for the final sprint of the legislative session. I would argue optimistic to think that we're going to get done on time, but it could happen. I think this conversation that we're having here today around Minneapolis disaster relief and the future of our cities is going to be a really critical aspect of the remaining weeks of legislative session. We know that we need to get a biennial budget passed. There are lots of dynamics at play with the only divided legislature in the country. And I think that this is going to be one of those issues that you're going to consistently hear about. How do we bring the resources to bear necessary to support the rebuilding and reinvestment in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul from the civil unrest? So I would anticipate that the Star Tribune and other media outlets are going to continue to cover this as a really critical part of the legislative conversation in the weeks to come.
Right. And we do have a couple questions that came in from Nicholas Koch. What policies might be able to link David's balance of payments perspectives with Jonathan and Jill's one Minnesota view?
I'm happy to jump in here, and Jill, cut me off whenever you'd like to. I think there are a lot of areas where this is already showing up. We're hearing legislators use this data, and that's what it is. It's just a balls and strikes set of data to frame a different narrative. We live in an environment where it's really easy to get caught up in your own set of information and facts. What this balance of payments report does is equips policymakers at all levels of government with some really clear and defined data around the contributions of the city of Minneapolis. So again, I'll go back to where I started. It's my hope that people look at this not as an adversarial body of data, not as we generate 3.5 times more and we want it back, but rather we need to continue to do that. And we want to continue to fund education and broadband and roads and bridges and infrastructure all across the state. But in order to do that, we can't sustain another 10 months of piles of rubble on Lake Street and Broadway and in Uptown. We need to show up and respond to that disaster in the way that it needs to be responded to, and build back the economy that's going to continue to drive the resources to fuel our state.
sure. Another question was, how might the outstate communities that we have supported for years be able to help the Metro core? Jill, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, obviously, individually, we're looking for that support. I'm curious to see how some of these actual funding can put in place, and not really understanding myself what those next steps are. But definitely we need to get back to Minneapolis as a place to come and visit and eat, play, and live, for sure. But maybe someone else can touch on those other issues. Yeah.
I think of this in two ways, Christina. There's obviously the legislative path, and we're in the thick of that, and that's a core to the work that the chamber does. And for the city of Minneapolis, we're talking about $200 million in appropriation bonds for disaster relief. And I hope that the message is clear to greater Minnesota legislators and legislators all across our state that that would be a good investment. Like when we always think about return on investment in the private sector and the business community, there's no greater return on investment than getting a city like Minneapolis back to a 3.5 to 1 return on investment to the state. I think secondarily, as we think about just the 3.5, 4 million Minnesotans, it's thinking about kind of that interconnectedness. I can't wait to go visit a greater Minnesota cabin and patronize the bar and restaurant and grocery store. I would hope that there's a similar feeling that people can't wait to get back to the field in US Bank Stadium and Target Center, or go to the Uptown Art Fair and maybe begin thinking more broadly about the Metro as a destination for arts and culture and leisure and entertainment. And that's going to be the thing that I think drives this One Minnesota message forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to end it here unless there's any more questions or any more closing thoughts. Give you a couple minutes back to your morning. I thought this was a great conversation. I learned a lot, especially talking about our great city of Minneapolis, the balance of payment report, the first in our exciting new series. So I just wanted to thank Jonathan, Jill, and Dave for participating in your insight. It's a really exciting time, I think, to kind of start this rebuild in Minneapolis. So again, if anybody has any more questions or like to learn more, again, you can see the slide up here. Go to anew612.com, and this recording and the information from Dave's report will be sent out to everybody who signed up for this webinar. So hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you for tuning in.